At my dad's retirement party, I flew in, paid for the venue, and even arranged for the caterer. But when I stood to speak, my sister cut me off and said, "You don't get to pretend you're part of this family just because you have money now." Everyone laughed. Even my dad just said, "Sit down, smile." And my Uber was already outside. I, 32M, had been planning Dad's retirement party for 3 months. After 28 years as a high school principal, he deserved something special. I'd flown in from Seattle, booked the country club venue, arranged the catering, even hired a photographer. The whole thing cost me nearly $8,000, but seeing Dad happy was worth every penny. I should have known better. Growing up, I was always the outsider in my own family. My sister was Dad's golden child, captain of the debate team, valedictorian, full scholarship to law school. I was the kid who struggled with dyslexia, barely graduated, and took years to find my footing. When I finally made it in tech, building a successful consulting firm from nothing, the family dynamic never shifted. I was still just the screw-up who got lucky. The party was perfect. 70 guests, Dad's favorite prime rib, a slideshow of his career highlights. I stood in the back watching him laugh with old colleagues, feeling proud that I'd made this happen. For once, I thought I might actually belong. When it came time for speeches, I walked to the front. I'd prepared something heartfelt about Dad's dedication to education, how he'd shaped thousands of young minds. My hands shook slightly as I tapped the microphone. My sister appeared beside me like a shark sensing blood. She placed her hand firmly on my arm and spoke loud enough for everyone to hear. She told me I didn't get to pretend I was part of this family just because I had money now. The room erupted in laughter. Even the catering staff smirked. I felt my face burn as every eye in the room locked onto me. Dad sat at the head table, and for a moment I thought he might defend me. Instead, he waved his hand dismissively and told me to sit down and smile. The laughter continued. Someone in the back shouted that at least I was good for something. More chuckles rippled through the crowd. I stood there frozen, holding the microphone like an idiot, while my sister basked in the attention. I set the microphone down and walked toward the exit. My Uber was already waiting outside. I'd scheduled it optimistically for after my speech. The driver asked if the party ended early, and I told him something like that. Back in my hotel room, I made a decision that would change everything. I called my lawyer first thing Monday morning. I explained that I needed to establish some boundaries with my family, particularly around a significant financial commitment I'd been considering. He listened carefully and assured me he could handle the legal aspects of what I had in mind. You see, 6 months earlier, Dad had mentioned his retirement plans during one of our rare phone calls. His pension was decent but not generous, and he was worried about keeping the family home. The property taxes alone were eating into his savings. I'd quietly been planning to pay off his mortgage as a retirement gift, all $140,000 of it. My lawyer drafted the paperwork that week. The mortgage payoff was ready to execute, but now it came with conditions. Very specific conditions. Dad called me 2 weeks later, panic evident in his voice. The bank had apparently been calling about some issues with his mortgage renewal. Could I help? I told him I'd look into it and get back to him. I let him sweat for exactly 1 week. When I finally called back, I explained that I'd been planning to pay off his mortgage completely as a retirement gift. I could practically hear his relief through the phone. He started thanking me profusely, saying he knew he could count on me, that I was such a good son. Then I delivered the conditions. The mortgage payoff would happen, but it came with a legally binding agreement. If anyone in the family ever publicly humiliated me again, particularly at family gatherings, the house would immediately transfer to my name. He'd have 30 days to vacate. No exceptions, no negotiations. Dad went quiet. He asked if I was serious, and I assured him I was completely serious. My lawyer had made sure the agreement was ironclad. One more incident like the retirement party, and he'd lose his home. He tried to laugh it off, saying I was being dramatic. I reminded him of exactly what happened at his party, how my sister cut me off, how he told me to sit down, how the entire room laughed at me while I stood there humiliated. I asked him if he thought that was acceptable treatment for someone who'd just spent $8,000 celebrating him. The line went quiet for a long time. Finally, he agreed to the terms. What choice did he have? Without the mortgage payment, he'd lose the house anyway within 6 months. The paperwork was signed within a week. Dad's mortgage was paid in full, and my lawyer filed the conditional ownership agreement with the county. Everything was completely legal and binding. For 3 months, things were different. Dad called more often, actually asked about my business, remembered details about my life. My sister's texts became notably more polite. The whole family dynamic shifted when they realized I held the cards now. I thought maybe I'd finally earned some respect. Update 1. The test came at Thanksgiving. I drove down for the family dinner, cautiously optimistic. Maybe the agreement had actually changed things. Maybe they'd finally treat me like family instead of the obligation they tolerated. Dinner went smoothly at first. Dad asked about my latest contract, seemed genuinely interested in my work. My sister was civil, even asked about my girlfriend. I started to relax, thinking maybe we'd turned a corner. Then my cousin brought up the retirement party. He'd apparently heard about my dramatic exit and thought it was hilarious. He asked my sister to tell the story again, said it was comedy gold. I watched my sister's face carefully. She glanced at Dad, then at me. For a moment, I thought she might actually decline. Instead, she launched into an animated retelling of how she'd put me in my place at the party. The table erupted in laughter again. My aunt said I'd probably learned my lesson about trying to buy my way into the family's good graces. My cousin suggested they should charge me admission to family events from now on. Dad sat at the head of the table, not participating but not stopping it either. When the laughter died down, he looked at me with what I can only describe as a challenge in his eyes. He asked if I was going to storm out again. I smiled and told him I wouldn't need to. I excused myself to the bathroom and called my lawyer from the hallway. The agreement had been violated in front of multiple witnesses. I gave him the go-ahead to execute the transfer immediately. When I returned to the table, I sat down calmly and finished my dinner. The conversation had moved on to other topics, but I could feel the smugness radiating from my sister. She thought she'd won again. After dessert, I stood up and thanked everyone for a lovely evening. I told Dad I had some paperwork for him to review when he had a moment. Nothing urgent, just some details about the house. I handed him the folder my lawyer had prepared. Inside were the transfer documents and a 30-day notice to vacate. The house was now legally mine. Dad opened the folder right there at the table. I watched his face go white as he processed what he was reading. My sister asked what it was, and Dad just stared at me in shock. I explained calmly that the house was now mine, as per our agreement. He had 30 days to find new living arrangements. Everyone else at the table thought I was joking until they saw Dad's expression. My sister snatched the papers and read them frantically. She started screaming that this was insane, that I couldn't actually do this to our father. I assured her that I could and I had. The agreement was legally binding and had been violated in front of multiple witnesses. The room exploded into chaos. My aunt called me heartless. My cousin said I was the worst son he'd ever seen. My sister was crying and yelling simultaneously, saying I was destroying the family over a stupid joke. Dad just sat there, staring at the papers. Finally, he looked up at me and asked if this was really what I wanted. I told him what I wanted was to be treated with basic respect by my own family. Since that seemed impossible, I'd settle for legal compliance with our agreement. I left them there arguing and drove back to my hotel. My phone buzzed with calls and texts all night, but I ignored them all. Update 2. The next morning brought a parade of family members to my hotel. My sister arrived first, mascara streaked and desperate. She begged me to reconsider, said she was sorry about the party, that it was just family teasing. I reminded her that this was the second time she'd publicly humiliated me, and asked why I should believe she was actually sorry now. She promised it would never happen again, swore she'd learned her lesson. I asked her why she needed to humiliate me to learn basic decency toward her brother. She had no answer. Dad showed up an hour later. He looked like he'd aged 5 years overnight. He sat heavily in the hotel lobby chair and asked what it would take to fix this. I told him it was simple: respect. Basic human respect from his own family. He said he'd always respected me, and I laughed out loud. I reminded him of every family gathering where I'd been the punchline, every achievement of mine that had been dismissed, every time he'd chosen my sister's side over basic fairness. I asked him when exactly this respect had manifested. Dad went quiet. After a long moment, he admitted that maybe they hadn't always treated me fairly. But family was supposed to forgive, supposed to stick together. I pointed out that forgiveness required actual remorse, not just panic over consequences. The rest of the family took turns throughout the day. My aunt offered to pay me back for the retirement party expenses if I'd just tear up the papers. My uncle suggested family therapy. Even my grandmother called, crying about how I was tearing apart the family. Each conversation followed the same pattern. They were sorry I felt hurt, but this was an overreaction. Family was everything, and I was throwing it away over pride. Not one of them acknowledged that their behavior had been genuinely wrong, only that I was being too sensitive about it. By evening, I was emotionally drained but resolved. I'd given them decades to treat me with basic respect, and they'd consistently chosen to see me as the family ATM instead. The retirement party had been my breaking point, and Thanksgiving had proven they hadn't learned anything. I called my lawyer and confirmed the timeline. Dad had 26 days to vacate. Update 3. 2 weeks later, my sister played her final card. She'd found Dad a small apartment across town and was helping him move. She called me sobbing, saying Dad was heartbroken and depressed. The shame of losing his house was killing him, and it was all my fault. I listened to her guilt trip and then asked a simple question. Was she calling to apologize for her behavior, or just to make me feel bad about enforcing consequences? The silence stretched long enough to answer my question. She finally said that yes, she was genuinely sorry for how she'd treated me. She'd been thinking about it for weeks and realized she'd been horrible. She just wanted her family back together. I told her I'd consider returning the house under one condition. She needed to publicly acknowledge what she'd done wrong, specifically and completely, in front of the same family members who'd witnessed her humiliating me. No excuses, no justifications, just full accountability. She agreed immediately. Too immediately. We arranged a family dinner for the following weekend. Everyone would be there, the same crowd from Thanksgiving. My sister would make her apology, take full responsibility, and then we'd discuss the house. I showed up with my lawyer, which surprised everyone. Dad looked confused, asking why I'd brought legal representation to a family dinner. I explained that trust needed to be rebuilt carefully, with proper documentation. My sister stood up after the main course, visibly nervous. She began what sounded like a genuine apology. She acknowledged that she'd repeatedly humiliated me in front of family, that she'd been jealous of my success and had taken it out on me unfairly. She said she was ashamed of her behavior and begged for my forgiveness. The room was quiet. I actually felt a flicker of hope that maybe, finally, we could move forward. Then she added the kicker. She said that while her behavior had been wrong, losing the family home was a disproportionate punishment. She hoped that now that she'd apologized, I'd be reasonable about returning it. My lawyer handed me a document he'd been holding. I stood up and explained that my sister's apology, while nice, proved she still didn't understand the situation. She thought this was a negotiation, that an apology was currency she could spend to buy back the house. I read from the document, a detailed timeline of every instance of family humiliation I'd endured over the past 5 years. The retirement party was just the most recent example. The pattern was clear and consistent. I existed to be their financial resource and emotional punching bag. My sister interrupted, saying that wasn't fair, that families tease each other. I asked her to name one time, just one, when the teasing had gone the other direction. When had anyone ever made jokes at her expense for the family's entertainment? The silence was deafening. I continued reading. The document outlined exactly how much money I'd spent on family events, gifts, and bailouts over the years. Nearly $60,000 of generosity that had been met with contempt and ridicule. Dad finally spoke up, asking what I wanted from them. I told him it was too late for what I'd wanted. I'd wanted a family that respected me, but I'd settled for a family that feared consequences. Since they'd proven they couldn't manage even that level of basic decency, I was done trying. The house would remain mine. Dad could stay in his apartment, and I'd even help with the rent for the first year as a final gesture of goodwill. But the days of treating me like the family doormat were over. I left my lawyer's card on the table and walked out. This time, no one laughed. Final update. 6 months later, Dad called me. His voice was different, quieter, more thoughtful. He said he'd been doing a lot of reflecting since losing the house, and he finally understood what I'd been trying to tell them. He didn't ask for the house back. Instead, he apologized. Really apologized, with no conditions or expectations attached. He said he'd failed me as a father by allowing the family dynamic to become so toxic, and he was sorry it had taken such drastic measures for him to see it. We talked for 2 hours. He told me about conversations he'd had with my sister, how they'd both started recognizing patterns and how they'd treated me over the years. The retirement party hadn't been an isolated incident. It had been the culmination of decades of dismissive behavior. My sister had been going to therapy, apparently. She'd realized that her treatment of me had been rooted in insecurity about her own achievements. Despite her academic success, I'd built something from nothing while she'd struggled to find her footing after law school. Taking me down a peg had been her way of dealing with that inadequacy. I appreciated the insights, but I wasn't ready to rebuild bridges. Trust, once broken so completely, doesn't heal quickly. Dad didn't push. He just said that whenever I was ready, if I was ever ready, they'd be there. He was proud of what I'd accomplished and ashamed of how long it had taken him to say so. I still have the house. Sometimes I drive by and see Dad tending a small garden at his apartment complex. He seems content enough, maybe even happier without the burden of maintaining a large property. My sister sends occasional texts, not asking for anything, just sharing life updates. Baby steps toward rebuilding something resembling a relationship. The family gatherings happen without me now. I spend holidays with friends and my girlfriend's family, people who've never felt the need to humiliate me for entertainment. It's peaceful in a way I never experienced growing up. Did I destroy my family over pride and money? Maybe. But I prefer to think I finally learned to value myself enough to walk away from people who couldn't see my worth. Sometimes the only way to teach people how to treat you is to stop accepting anything less than basic human decency. The house sits empty most of the time now, but it serves its purpose. It's a tangible reminder that actions have consequences, that family bonds don't excuse cruel behavior, and that sometimes you have to lose everything to realize what actually mattered. I sleep better at night knowing I'll never again stand in front of a room full of people who are supposed to love me, only to be made the punchline of their entertainment. That's worth more than any amount of money or family drama. Some bridges are meant to be burned.